Yeah, time to round up one of football's top business stories with Tesco Mobile for Business. And Simon, today we're going to be talking about some of the comments made by UEFA President Aleksander Ceferin. We speak about this individual now and again. I haven't met him. I've never shaken his right mitt. Have you?
No, I have not.
No, we have not. Anyway, we'll press on. We'll talk about him. And basically, the topic, multi-club ownership. And we all know about that, don't we, Palace fans? Crystal Palace, of course, demoted from the Europa League to the Europa Conference League. And this was at the heart of it. Ceferin has said that he sympathises with Crystal Palace fans after the club was demoted to the Europa Conference League due to multi-club ownership rules. But he said the credibility of European competition has and must be protected. Now, he goes into this in an interview with an organisation called Politico. But if you remember, thanks to Simon negotiating that the man in the middle of this furore involving Crystal Palace, John Textor, Simon managed to persuade Textor to come to us via Eurostar from Paris to this studio. And of course, at that time, he was in the thick of this multi-club ownership issue, and he spoke about it and how he'd found himself in there.
I'll admit to not even thinking about the issue. Of course, I have to. But I also read the rule. So please read the rule yourself. Like, everybody's talking about it like it's so obvious. The rule's very clear. If you have decisive influence, you may need to consider this. I don't. I didn't. If I had decisive influence, I wouldn't have been trying to sell the club starting in June of 2024. And if UEFA wants to look what they're doing, if you have a multi-club problem, they say, well, sell off your interest or get out of governance. Well, I did. I hired an investment bank. I was already out.
In spite of what Texter was saying, Palace nonetheless are playing Europa Conference League football, and it's really because of the issue that he was involved in. Ceferin says it's not UEFA's fault that happened. They will still play in Europe, and that's a good thing. He says, I wasn't included in the decision-making process, takes himself out of that. But he said, I just knew the result. But of course, I feel sorry. It's not the fault of the fans, and it's not the fault of UEFA, and it's not the fault of the players and the coaches. Here's the thing, though, Simon. I mean, Ceferin says that UEFA rules mean it's quite simple. You can't have two clubs owned by the same individual in the same European competition. Now, do you get it now, Mr. John Texter? And I'm sure that he does. Ceferin's arguments, do they still stack up after everything that we came through with Texter?
Well, it comes down to what you consider ownership to look like and what you consider decisive influence to be, because that was the argument that John Texter was advancing. Palace advanced different arguments that they weren't part of a multi-club ownership model, albeit their majority shareholder owned other clubs. Ostensibly, when he entered into his agreement with Crystal Palace, he owned other clubs on other continents, so it wouldn't have come into conflict, because ultimately owning clubs in Brazil wouldn't have conflicted owning a club in Europe, because they don't play in the same competitions besides the FIFA
Yeah, but he still had Lyon and Palace.
Not at that time, he didn't. When he bought his shares in Crystal Palace, he didn't have his shareholding in Lyon. He had it post his acquisition of his shares in Crystal Palace.
He did when the deadline was meant to be hit.
We're talking about the construct of the situation surrounding Crystal Palace, taking in him as a shareholder and then ultimately allowing him to buy other shares, and then ultimately looking at the multi-club ownership, and then looking at decisive influence. Palace's whole position was, and it's really quite sustainable for them to have made this position, was that he didn't have decisive influence. The decisive influence lay with the chairman, Steve Parish. There's no doubt about it. And the protocol that UEFA wished to determine, which is the lack of integrity around the sport and lack of credibility, needs to grow up. And so does the idea around associated party transactions that Manchester City drove a bus through the Premier League rules and said, well, hang on a second, what is associated party transactions? Because we can look at the whole round the world and say, how many businesses have you got? You open up a global, a world of global investment, you're going to have people that are interacting with one another because they've got shared business interests.
Right, so you're not having it when Ceferin says to allow two clubs to be owned by the same owner and play in the same competition is a no-go for us because of the credibility of the competition.
Well, my answer to that would be, how do you protect the credibility? You either refuse to allow people to buy shareholding in more than one club. Go ahead with that, see how you get on with that. Because they can't do it, otherwise they would have stopped it by now, suggesting that they can't, they prohibit it. If you own a football club, because you've got to get different federations to cooperate with different people at different times, you've also got the idea that most of the people that are able to buy multi-clubs have got more money than the people that they are going to be contesting the argument against in the first place. The reasons why we have multi-club ownership, the reasons why the City Group have clubs all over the world now is because they're able to push back against the restrictive covenants of the football governance, which is not fit for purpose a lot of the time. So the simple answer would be, most people would say, well, if you don't want something, why don't you just outlaw it full stop, and then there's no question, there's no debate, there's no controversy. Then ask yourself why they haven't.
And why haven't they?
Because
it's too late now, isn't it?
Because they can't.
Ceferin can't be seen to put a line through multi-club ownership now. We've moved on from that. We don't believe that any longer.
If you allow something in the first place, if you didn't allow it in the first place, then you wouldn't have the question to be asked or answered.
No, I get that.
Right? And the reasons why they have allowed it is because you've seen various arguments run by the RB group that drove a coach and horses through the idea of multi-club ownership when they separated themselves from Salzburg and Leipzig and ran arguments about different reasons for the different ownership models not being all under one ownership banner, and got away with that. And then you look at the other ownership models that are in place and say, well, what is it? If you have now accepted global investment in sport, and you've accepted that sport has a different set of parameters than lots of other different businesses because of the collective bargaining and responsibility that clubs have with competitivity, what is the fixture to having multi-club ownership? Because if you have a business, clearly you want to have as many subsidiaries that can create an opportunity to make your business better. Clearly, the multi-club ownership has some merits attached to it. So how does football grow up and say, right, I protect myself against the questions of integrity. I know what I'll do. I'll allow people to suggest they're not owner of the football club by putting their shares in a blind trust for a year. And then they can reverse out of it when it suits them. I'll allow, with due respect to the conversation, Nottingham Forest's owner to do the hokey-cokey about whether he's the owner or not. I'm in, I'm out, as he was doing when he ultimately filed, oh, actually, I'm not going to be in the Europa League, I'll come back in as owner again. Who did they think was going to actually run Nottingham Forest if Marinakis wasn't involved in terms of his blind trust? Someone else has got Marinakis' money, have they? It's silly. It's not grown up, it's not proper thinking, but that is what football has become. Because we've now got, and like Arsene Wenger said to me, and I disagreed with it at the time when I saw him over in Zurich, which was what's changed in football is not the fans, is not the players, which I disagree with, is the owners. To some extent, he's right, because the ownership models have changed the way that the governance of football is having to operate. Because the governance in football just made rules up as it went along. See you over there, I'm going to fine you a week's wages. If you did that in any other walk of life, you can't. If you turn up late for here, you can't get fined a week's wages. In football, you can. And that, to me, would probably breach most employment contracts in any other walk of life.
See, I think in you, I see a John Texter. Am I right? Because if you had to do it all again and you made all the money you made and you own a top football club, you're the sort of guy that would want to own another.
Well, I did.
And maybe another.
I did.
And maybe another.
I did. I wanted to own, I tried to get involved with potentially owning Malaga because there was an opportunity there when I was in Spain. I tried and looked at very seriously the Auckland Kings. I looked at Northern Spirit, which was an Australian club based in Sydney. Now, they wouldn't have been conflicting.
Right.
I opened a team in America, albeit under the badge of Crystal Palace, but notwithstanding, it was a team in America that I wanted to shove my younger players out there to play in the MLS.
But if you couldn't have owned more than one, Simon, would you have got involved in football in the first place?
Well, the question that you have to ask yourself of Crystal Palace's conundrum is why they didn't protect themselves earlier against the challenges that were put in place.
Exactly.
And the answer to that is they were remiss. And you can dress it up how you want. And I think Steve Parish should be given loads and loads of praise. And coming from me, that's difficult for me to say, but it is true. Most of the things that he's done have benefited Crystal Palace. Of course, they've benefited himself, but they've benefited Crystal Palace. In this instance, there is no doubt, whether people think I'm having a go at him or not, that they got it wrong. They should, if they'd have gone to council's opinion and asked when Texter decided to buy into Lyon, am I in any jeopardy here for anything that comes down the line if we are somehow successful in the Premier League? And council would have given him an answer, and they would have positioned themselves in such a way that they would have been able to negate the problem or accept it. But to go into the various hearings in UEFA and rely on decisive influence being the only game in town, because it's clear. The other thing that is also needs to be clear and understood is economic benefits is not the same as decisive influence. Often in life it is, because ultimately the person in the room with the money is the reasons why things get done. But in this instance, the economic benefits of John Texter owning 43% of Crystal Palace did not manifest itself in the decisive influence that possibly Palace were able to exhibit through Steve Parish's mandate via his shareholders agreement, which is I run the football club, I make the decisions, and ultimately that's the end of the conversation.
Before we leave this, is he going to buy Sheffield Wednesday?
Don't know. I don't know. I spoke to him very briefly the other day, and he's on his way to England, I think, but I don't know.
All right. Maybe when he gets you, we'll ask him.